Czechast, a podcast in English about Czech and Moravian society, history, culture and economy.
Hello and welcome to Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. I'm Vít Pohanka and today I've prepared something a little different, a podcast special I like to call The Explainer. So let me explain. As I grow older, I find myself noticing a certain human tendency, one that the media often amplifies. We tend to think that we live in exceptionally bad or uniquely turbulent times, that what we are experiencing right now is unprecedented or somehow worse than anything that came before. But usually it takes just a brief look at history to realize that our anxieties aren't new at all. Other generations faced similar dilemmas, conflicts and uncertainties, sometimes far greater than the ones we deal with today. And I think that to a certain extent that applies to the present situation here in Czechia, where, for example, President Petr Pavel has found himself in what I would not quite call an argument, but certainly a kind of political tug-of-war with the likely future Prime Minister Andrej Babiš, the billionaire owner of the Agrofert holding and the leader of the ANO party. Their disagreement centers on whether Babiš must publicly explain how he plans to resolve his conflict of interest before being appointed Prime Minister. Something President Pavel insists on and something Babiš says he was never formally told. At first glance, this may seem like a modern dispute shaped by today's laws, today's personalities and today's media environment. But when we take even a short step back into history, we discover that the relationship between the president and the head of government has always been a source of tension, ever since the days of Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and the very first Czechoslovak cabinets. So, in this episode, we'll explore how the balance of power between presidents and prime ministers has evolved over the past century. Through the First Republic, the crisis of 1938 and the government in exile and the post-war years, through communism, the Velvet Revolution, the presidencies of Václav Havel, Václav Klaus and Miloš Zeman, and finally, to today's dynamic between Petr Pavel and Andrej Babiš. I'm Vít Pohanka and thank you for listening to Czechast.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.
Nerozčilujme se otázkami hospodářskými a politickými. Problém dneška není jen hospodářský a politický, nýbrž
Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk speaking to the Czech nation in 1934. His voice may sound distant now, almost from another world. But during the lifetime he enjoyed a level of respect that is difficult to imagine today. For a majority of Czechs, Masaryk was not just the head of state. He was the father of the new republic, the person who had given political form to their national aspirations. Newspapers and magazines of the First Republic frequently portrayed him in a near reverential tones. It would be only a slight exaggeration to say that Czechoslovakia briefly flirted with a kind of democratic cult of personality around him, a soft aura of infallibility that made open criticism virtually impossible. Masaryk's presence was so strong that many naturally assumed the president would be the dominant figure of political life in the new country. And symbolically, he certainly was. He represented the Republic abroad, embodied its democratic ideals, and served as a moral compass for a state still discovering its identity. But when Czechoslovakia adopted its first constitution in 1920, the document took a much more restrained view of the presidential authority. It established a system in which the president was important, yes, but the real machinery of government lay elsewhere. That machinery was entrusted to the Prime Minister and his cabinet, who exercised what the Constitution called governmental and executive power. They ran the ministries, proposed legislation, and crucially depended on the confidence of Parliament. The President appointed them, but usually in line with political mathematics. Who held a majority, who could form a coalition, who could actually govern. In practice, the Prime Minister, far more than the head of state, held the day-to-day keys to the Republic. This didn't mean, however, that the presidency lacked influence. On paper, the office looked formidable. The power to appoint the prime minister, to command the armed forces, to sign laws, to represent the state in foreign affairs. But almost every presidential action required a minister's counter-signature. Without a willing minister, the president's pen simply couldn't move. The idea was clear. The president would speak for the nation, but responsibility and accountability belonged to the elected government. In reality, the balance depended just as much on personality as on constitutional theory. Masaryk shaped politics through the sheer force of his moral authority, through private conversations, through the immense trust he inspired. And this proved to be fertile ground for frequent, if not constant, tension between the head of state and the head of government. Even within the very first months of independence, it quickly became clear that Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and his first prime minister, Karel Kramář, were anything but an ideal pair. At the start, they were politically partners by necessity. Masaryk was elected president, Kramář became the head of government, but the partnership never settled into harmony. In early 1919, Kramář left for the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles, where he remained until September. His prolonged absence effectively ceded the public stage to Masaryk, whose popularity and authority grew even further while the prime minister was far from home. During this period, their disagreements deepened. Masaryk strongly opposed Kramář's efforts to promote a military intervention against Bolshevik Russia, an idea Kramář saw as both strategically necessary and morally justified. As historian Jan Bílek notes, the dynamic between them had flipped. Where Kramář had been the rising star of the 1890s, it was Masaryk who now set the tone of real politics in the new state in 1919 and 1920. Kramář considered his role at the peace conference as patriotic duty, but domestically he paid a high price for his absence. In the summer of 1919, while he was still abroad, his government resigned, and upon returning, he never again gained a position of real executive influence. And that was further strained by their differing attitudes towards Edvard Beneš, who had been close to Masaryk and served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Kramář's government. In 1921, Kramář became convinced that Beneš had acted disloyally toward him during the peace conference. He complained about it to Masaryk, but Masaryk immediately sided with Beneš, who was technically his prime minister's underling. This sparked a long-lasting conflict that dragged on for nearly a decade. In private correspondence from the time, Masaryk and Beneš exchanged harsh remarks about Kramář. In one letter, Beneš simply wrote, "Kramář is utterly impossible." They even discussed maneuvering him into the Senate, where they believed he could do the least political damage. Meanwhile, I think it needs to be said, in public, Kramář spoke of Beneš only in positive terms, and so he did about Masaryk. But the tensions were there, and they must have been really hard on Kramář. The first Czechoslovak Republic may have been the proverbial island of democracy surrounded by countries that started to tend toward authoritarian regimes and finally even Nazi dictatorship in case of Germany and then Austria. But it wouldn't be right to think that the political life in Czechoslovakia was some sort of oasis of stability. Between 1918 and 1938, the country went through nearly 20 different governments and around 10 prime ministers, a level of turnover that may surprise people who idealize the First Republic as a period of political calm. In reality, coalition building was a perpetual balancing act. Czech parties alone struggled to maintain stable majorities, and the situation was further complicated by the strong political presence of German-speaking parties in the border regions, Slovak autonomist movements, and Hungarian minority parties in southern Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia. These groups often had conflicting priorities, and while they occasionally joined coalition agreements, their cooperation was fragile. The result was a system that functioned democratically but under constant pressure, a republic whose unity depended on complex negotiations and uneasy compromises long before the dramatic crises of the late 1930s arrived. And in such an environment, even Masaryk's close working relationship with the long-standing Prime Minister Antonín Švehla had moments of tension. In the late 1920s, Švehla, who was overworked and often in poor health, submitted his resignation. Masaryk famously refused to accept it, telling him he would not appoint a successor and urging him to recover and continue. It was perhaps a small episode, but it revealed how the presidency operated in practice. Legally, the government was independent and responsible only to parliament. But in reality, a president with Masaryk's stature could hold a prime minister in place or delay change simply through personal authority. The constitution had dealt the cards to the cabinet, yet Masaryk's voice still carried decisive weight. When Edvard Beneš succeeded Masaryk in 1935, the balance between president and prime minister shifted again. Beneš was far more assertive, especially in foreign policy. His relationship with Prime Minister Milan Hoxha, a Slovak, grew increasingly strained during the Sudeten crisis of 1938. Hoxha, facing overwhelming pressure from Britain and France, leaned toward deeper concessions to avoid isolation, while Beneš believed too much was being surrendered too quickly. These were not just disagreements over tactics. They exposed a deeper question about who should guide the state in moments of existential danger. The constitution said the government governed and the president represented. But crises have a way of blurring boundaries, and in 1938, President and Prime Minister pushed against those boundaries from opposite sides.
That the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved.
The Munich Agreement and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia brought this long experiment in constitutional balance to an abrupt end. What followed was the short-lived Second Czechoslovak Republic, a fragile and demoralized state existing only for a few months between October 1938 and March 1939. Its leaders attempted to navigate an impossible situation, preserving sovereignty while accommodating the demands of Nazi Germany. Political life narrowed, democratic freedoms eroded, and the traditional roles of president and government were weakened by external pressure and internal crisis. Any meaningful division of powers became largely theoretical as the state struggled simply to survive. That struggle ended in March 1939 when German troops occupied the Czech lands and Slovakia declared nominal independence under heavy German influence. For the next 6 years, there was no real functioning Czechoslovak government at home at all. President Edvard Beneš continued the republic's legal existence in exile in London, working with a government in exile that relied on diplomacy rather than parliamentary legitimacy. In that extraordinary context, the relationship between president and prime minister took on a new character, less about constitutional boundaries, more about maintaining continuity and international recognition for a state that had ceased to exist in practice.
Dr. Edvard Beneš, president of Czechoslovakia, returns to his native land.
After the war, Beneš returned to Prague and resumed the presidency of the restored Czechoslovakia, but the political landscape had changed fundamentally. The post-war government was dominated by the Communist Party, whose representatives held key ministries and increasingly dictated the direction of domestic policy. Although Beneš remained a respected national figure, his authority was gradually overshadowed by the growing influence of Klement Gottwald as prime minister. Tensions culminated as Beneš, as aging president, only hesitatingly resisted communist efforts to centralize control, and the space for genuine presidential influence was shrinking rapidly. By February 1948, the balance of power had tipped entirely. The communist takeover transformed Czechoslovakia into a one-party totalitarian state. The space for genuine presidential influence was shrinking until it disappeared. By February 1948, the balance of power had tipped entirely. The communist takeover transformed Czechoslovakia into a one-party totalitarian state. In this new system, constitutional roles became secondary to party hierarchy. The offices of president and prime minister continued to exist, but their occupants, regardless of title, were subordinate to the general secretary of the Communist Party, who, with the exception of General Ludvík Svoboda in the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, in fact united both functions. Thus, consecutive communist presidents, Klement Gottwald, Antonín Zápotocký, Antonín Novotný, and then again Gustav Husák, ruled officially both the all-powerful Communist Party apparatus and served as the heads of state at the same time. There were politically skillful and influential prime ministers like Lubomír Štrougal, but formal responsibilities mattered less than ideological loyalty and position within the party apparatus. The nuanced relationship between head of state and head of government, so carefully defined in the constitution of Czechoslovakia, was effectively erased for more than 4 decades. When communism collapsed in 1989, Czechoslovakia had to rediscover what a genuine constitutional balance between president and government meant. The old pre-war model provided inspiration, but society had changed. The political system had to be rebuilt, and expectations for the role of the president were shaped as much by personalities as by legal texts. Into this moment stepped Václav Havel, a dissident playwright whose moral authority at home and abroad rivaled in some ways that of Masaryk. Havel believed deeply in the symbolic role of the presidency, but he was also determined to guide the country through its democratic revival. That sometimes brought him into tensions with governments led by Václav Klaus, later by the leaders of independent Czechia after 1993. Havel saw the president as an ethical guardian. Klaus believed governance belonged firmly to elected cabinets. They had frequent disagreements in the 1990s, and it reflected 2 competing visions of how much influence a president should wield in a modern parliamentary democracy.
As responsible politicians, we know that we have to act when it is necessary.
The presidency shifted again when Václav Klaus himself became the head of state in 2003. Klaus embraced a more restrained, legalistic reading of presidential powers, at least formally. In practice, however, he often used timing, interpretation, and political messaging to influence cabinet decisions and shape public debate. The constitution still made clear that the government governed and the president represented, but in a politically divided society, even symbolic gestures from the castle or the seat of the presidency could carry significant weight. Klaus showed how the presidency could operate as both constitutional role and political platform, sometimes complementing governments, sometimes challenging them, especially in their positions towards European Union, because Václav Klaus was becoming increasingly Eurosceptic or Euro-realistic, as he would call it himself. The shift that made the next stage possible came in 2013, when Czech Republic abandoned the parliamentary model of choosing the head of state and moved to direct presidential elections. The change didn't come out of nowhere. After the bruising and highly controversial parliamentary elections of Václav Klaus in 2003 and again in 2008, when the divided chambers descended into days of deadlock, defections and intense political horse trading, confidence in the old system collapsed. Lawmakers across the spectrum concluded that the office needed a clearer democratic mandate and that the opaque bargaining behind closed doors could not continue. When the constitution was amended, the first beneficiary was Miloš Zeman, who was elected in 2013 and used his direct mandate far more expansively than any of his predecessors, arguing that a president elected by millions should naturally be a central political actor, not merely a symbolic figure. So, as the first directly elected president of Czechia, Zeman interpreted his position in the most assertive way the constitution had yet seen. He refused certain ministerial nominations and openly influenced coalition negotiations. Critics argue that he stretched the constitutional order to its limits. Supporters claimed he was simply fulfilling the role of an active elected head of state. Under Zeman, the delicate balance between president and prime minister tilted noticeably in favor of the castle. The result was a decade in which Czech politics often revolved as much around presidential interventions as around the decisions of elected governments. And that brings us to the present, to President Petr Pavel and the ongoing discussion with would-be Prime Minister Andrej Babiš. In a way, it is quite obvious that Pavel presents himself as a stabilizing figure closer to the First Republic ideal of a unifying head of state. Yet, controversy over whether Babiš must publicly outline how he will divest himself from conflicts of interest before being appointed shows that the boundaries remain contested. So, the questions arise. Is the Czech president merely a constitutional notary who appoints governments, or does he have a moral responsibility to ensure that future prime ministers comply not only with the law but with its spirit? And does a party leader who won the most votes owe transparency to the president alone or the public? As we have seen, for more than a century, these have been the recurring questions in Czech political life. From Masaryk's moral authority, through Beneš's wartime leadership, Havel's ethical presidency, Klaus's assertiveness, and Zeman's personalized interpretation of power, every era has redrawn the line between the castle, the seat of the president, and the government office in Strakova Akademie. In this context, today's tension between President Pavel and the would-be Prime Minister Andrej Babiš is not an anomaly. It is the latest chapter in the long story about how Czech democracy interprets the relationship between those who represent the state and those who actually govern it. And that brings us to the end of this Czechast special, an explainer, a look at how the relationship between Czechoslovak and Czech presidents and their prime ministers has been shaped, challenged, and constantly rediscovered for more than a century. If today's discussion between President Petr Pavel and Andrej Babiš feel unusual, history shows us that they are part of a much longer story, one that each generation rewrites in its own way. Thank you for listening to Czechast. If you enjoyed this episode or any of the others, please don't forget to follow, like, or even better, share the podcast with a friend. It really helps spread the word, and your feedback genuinely helps us shape future episodes. I'm Vít Pohanka, thanks again for joining me, and as always, stay curious, stay well, and until next time, as we say in Czech, naslyšenou.
Czechast, a podcast in English about all things Czech. Whether you're an English-speaking expat living in Czechia and Slovakia, or a descendant of the Czechs, Moravians and Slovaks who left for a better life in America, Australia, Britain or Canada so long ago that you don't speak the language of the old country, this podcast in English is for you.